Yo, what's up, Big Nick? Hey man, I just want to tell you that you did a great job. I thought your video was informative. I thought you came out as the authority, and I think overall it was a very smooth, very educational presentation. So first off, it's fantastic. I think it's good enough to get you the job. What my job here today is really to try to take it from being a great presentation to be fantastic. And there's not a whole lot of margin here. I think we're talking a matter of inches. So if you did nothing, and you just hone that a little bit more, you'd get the job, in my opinion. But if we want to take it just a little bit more, as somebody who likes to critique sales presentations and public speaking in general, here's a couple of minor things, just little, that I think will make a huge difference. Okay, I'm going to read down just a few things. Okay, the beginning. The opening was great. I thought you did a good job of kind of doing needs assessment. One minor thing I would consider, and I like to do this in my presentations, is, you know, if throughout the course of today this seems like this might be something of value, what I would encourage us to do is to continue this conversation in the next step, and we'll go over what the next steps are. But first, I want to show you what this is and how it's going to benefit you. And if you see value in this, I think you would agree, correct, that we would maybe make sense to go to that next step. But I want you to see it first. So I like the idea of doing multiple closes throughout the course of the presentation so that you don't build it all up to the very end. Because what I saw in this video is you did a lot of demonstration, you did a lot of case studying, and you framed it in a very nice way. But I think one area, if we're going to go from that great to fantastic, is I would do a bunch of micro closes throughout the whole process. So for example, let me see here, what was the timeline? Okay, so you talked about the timeline. This is the very beginning of the presentation. Yeah, so what is your process for reviewing software? I think it's a great question. I would change the question though. Instead of saying what's your process for reviewing, what's your process for reviewing software, I would maybe go something along the lines of, if we saw that this was something that was of value today, what would the timeline look like for moving forward with this? Okay, so what I'm talking about there is essentially you want them to not just talk in general how they review software. I don't think you really care about that. I think you care about how that relates to Salesforce's product. So you want to say something more along those lines, like if we looked at this today and it looked like something that you thought would be valuable to you, what would the next steps be, or how do we move forward? What would the timeline look like for that? So I would definitely push the timeline and then make it specific to Salesforce. So I think that's going to be a key one. All right. Okay, another thing. You do a great job of talking at a high level, and I think first off, Salesforce is going to love that because you're definitely hitting all the benchmarks when it comes to the terms, the acronyms, and even some of the internal jargon that Salesforce probably uses in their presentation. But one caution I would make here is to step back. So, and you did this a few times, and then a few times you didn't do this. So let me just kind of give you the blanket feedback. Whenever you introduce a new term, like for example, if you're going to say, you know, we're going to talk about recruiting, and then you then go into the definition of what Salesforce's solution for recruiting is. You know, Salesforce exists to help recruiting departments to become more efficient at doing A, B, and C, and D. That's great. I think that's good to have that kind of higher level view from the corporate line, what it is. But then I would challenge you to break it down to a level where Sarah, a level where Laura would be able to understand what it is you're saying. 99% of these guys are probably going to understand already, but when we're dropping terms like I think HIPAA or APIs, I know what those are because you'd explained them to me before, but I would break it down and say, okay, well, you know, this exists to do this. And basically what we're talking about here is consolidating information to make it easier for you to focus on what's important. You know, just something where it's like one line, super small elevator pitch, very simple, so that if they're following along, they're going to be able to step back and be like, okay, I get it. So that would be my first piece of feedback, and that's what I talked about. One, we want to do multiple closes throughout the whole process. Another one is we want to be doing check-ins throughout the whole presentation. So you did it in a couple of spaces, and I thought it was incredibly effective. It really, really was. So I would just check in and say, does that make sense, or do you see how that might be beneficial, right? I would be doing a lot of that throughout the whole presentation because what I've seen is it's such a good flow is that it kind of goes like this. You're just going through the whole thing, and that's really good. But for example, when you get done with the recruiting piece, say, so we talked a little bit about that, and this is the example that we talked about. But if you were to implement something like, do you see how that might actually increase efficiency for you? Do you see where this might be able to, some areas where there might be some of that redundancy we talked about? I would do that, because I like to break down, like, you talk on the presentation, and then you want to do like the Zach Morris style, where you're talking directly to the prospect. And I think that helps, because it kind of takes your presentator cap off, and now you're a colleague. You're just saying, look, I'm reading this to you, but does this make sense? Are you checking in? Are we good? Because at the very end, you're going to pull it all together, because you've asked them to check in with you, and they're confirming from the beginning, the middle, and the end that yes, this does seem like it adds value, and two, we are interested in learning more, so that when you ask for the close and the next step, this is a continuation from the process that you started from the beginning. Make sense? Okay. Okay, here's an idea. I don't know if this has play. You may or may not want to play around with it, but I would try it a little bit and see if you think it works. Before launching into an example, like you talked about William and Mary in the first one, just a thought. What about, instead of giving them the lay of the land first, introduce William and Mary. So say something like, the first example we're going to talk about for recruiting is at William and Mary. And if you're not familiar with them, they're a campus very similar to University of San Diego. But let me share with you some of the results they got by using Salesforce. And then after that, we'll talk about what they did to get those results. But I thought these were very, very substantial. And I would love to see what you think about them. But first is they increased efficiency by 35%. As soon as they implemented this. Another thing is they lowered redundancy by X amount of percentage. These are fantastic results. Now, do you see how that might be useful? I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to pitch it a little bit, but maybe presenting the results first and then saying, oh, now that I kind of shared some of these kind of eye-popping results, let's peel the onion back. How did they get there? Well, before we can see what they get there, let's talk about the problems that they had to solve to get there and see if you relate to this. So to get to that 30% decrease in redundancy, the problem was simple, is they were working in silos and people weren't communicating. Do you feel like, I mean, in my experience, this is a very common thing in the recruiting departments. Do you guys see that to be true here as well? I mean, based on my conversations with Bill, it seems like that. All right, so you're stepping out of presenter mode and now you're saying, look, are we all kind of in agreement that this is kind of a common problem? And you're looking for them to confirm that. So then you can move on to the next step and say, okay, well, here's how we did it, right? So you kind of wet their beak a little bit and then you bring them in, and I would kind of fill in the gaps that way. That's what I would do, but I don't know, again, what the format is for Salesforce, and maybe it doesn't have play. I would challenge you, maybe try it a couple different ways, record yourself 2 or 3 different ways, and see what makes sense, okay? Alrighty. Okay, yeah, so, and after you present the problems that maybe William and Mary faced, you can ask those follow-up questions like, does this seem to mirror some of the problems you guys have here on campus? Does this seem to be a common theme? I think I just said that, but I just want to read this again. You talked about advancement. I think those are really good. Again, challenge you to break it down in very simple terms after you go that high level. This is what the corporate line is for Salesforce. But really, at the end of the day, we're just about empowering you to focus on building relationships with alumni and not being caught up in the weeds, database management and talking to different departments. We do all the heavy lifting for you. Okay. Alrighty. All right, and then one of the things you talked about here was you talked about the student experience, and in your example, you gave a hypothetical of a student. An idea here. An idea would be maybe put it in the form of a question. So if I was a student at X college, I think this one was another private school, Minnesota or something like that. If I was a student at this college and I was going to go to the registrar office, how would I typically do that? Well, how would I typically do that? It's probably a similar situation as here. I would probably have to go here. And if that person didn't have, I would probably, and if, how would I accomplish this if I didn't get that done? Well, I would probably go here. And then if that didn't work, what would my response be? Well, I'd be frustrated, right? I'd be really difficult. And maybe you have an experience of that. I don't know. But I would kind of do it in the form of a question, so they're kind of following the dotted line throughout the process. And then you kind of bring in the whole, this is how we solve that problem. All right, and then at the very end, we talked about this already, but I would bring it back in from the beginning. One of the first things we talked about is if you saw that this would have value, that there may be some more exploring we want to do together. And I think from what I'm hearing, that seems like that might be something to look at. So let me see, where is see here. There was one really good point I had, and I wrote it down, but I didn't save it on my phone. Okay, so here's what I would do. So at the very end of your presentation, I would say, do you see how this might increase some of the efficiencies, reduce redundancy? Is there any reason this wouldn't add value to your organization, right? I would pitch it like that, kind of like a close, because I think what you did in your videos is, here's what I suggest for a next step, and I think that's fine. I think that's good, but I would say, is there any reason you wouldn't see this be a valuable resource to look a little bit further into, right? I wouldn't try to close them on buying it, but I would say something like that. Do you see any concerns why this maybe wouldn't have play here? Why this wouldn't maybe work at the University of San Diego, right? So you ask the question in negative to see if there's any actual reservations, and if they say no, I say, well, great. Well, here's what I recommend for my next step. That's what I was going to try to get at, is put the close in before you recommend the next step. This way you can address any roadblocks that they might have before going into bringing in your person to come in and do all that stuff. Hopefully I didn't go too much in the weeds there, but I thought overall a very solid presentation, Nick. This is really, we're talking about milli-inches to get you over that finish line. One small other thing, and again, your call on this. I'm a different presenter than you are. We have different personalities, but I would look at your video and listen to it, and maybe look at two things. One, tone inflection, and two, pauses. Those are very powerful tools in public speaking, as you know, and I felt like the presentation was really good. And when you do those check-ins, that would probably be a good time to kind of, instead of going at a straight line, stop and then go down, pause, ask for questions, maybe make a little levity, I don't know, and then move back into the presentation. Because I think one of the things I saw with the video is you're kind of operating at this structure, and that's because you're just trying to memorize the main focal points for this presentation, which is totally normal. And I'm sure the day of the presentation you're gonna nail it. But that would just be one piece. Two small presentation tweaks is create some pause, create some drama by using pauses and tone inflections to create different levels to keep your audience engaged throughout the process. So that would be it. I think those are it, man. I mean, again, I don't want you to think I'm just tearing it apart, but you reached out to me because you wanted some honest feedback from somebody who looks at sales presentations all the time. I'm a huge fan, connoisseur of people who talk about anything, and I think you're a great explainer. You're good at relaying all the information. So we're really talking about just minor tweaks that I think will make this go from fantastic to incredible. So great work, man. I'm going to send this over to you. Feel free to listen to it. Call me back if you want to talk about it in more detail. I'm going to be around the rest of today and probably tomorrow after I go to the airport. So I have a couple hours tomorrow when I'm at the airport and then when I land, so we can talk in the evening as well. Okay, bud? All right, man. Well, hey, I appreciate you, dude. Thank you so much for including me on this process. Elliot enjoyed listening to you. So did I. So take care, man.